Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of a Junior VC Behind the Scenes. This week, I'm joined by Varun and Sanya, and we're going to talk about this week's piece, Can Darwinbox Reimagine Human Capital from India to the World? So Varun, can you get us started by telling our listeners why we chose to write about this piece?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I think many of you may have heard Darwinbox. It's been in the news recently as it turned a unicorn. I think one of the first few companies to turn unicorn in this calendar year, raising a large round of 72 million from technology crossover ventures. Obviously, so that was one of the attractions. But I think what's really unique about the business is that a couple of things actually. First of all, it's in the business of human capital management, right? A niche that you don't end up talking about every day. You don't end up reading about every day. All the news is much more about delivery and logistics. So obviously as a space, it's unique, interesting. Secondly, it's also a company that wasn't born in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, right? It was based in Hyderabad. Started there and has been built fairly capital efficiently up to this point. I think they raised probably all of like $25-30 million before this round, and have got into unicorn, which is again very, very rare for companies to do in this day and age. And I think so that made for an interesting story, and hopefully that comes out through the blog as we read
it. Thanks, Varun, for that. And can you maybe walk us through their founding story and how they got started?
Yeah. Cool. So I think it had an interesting story. It was almost like the founders were meant to come together, right? I think Jayant and Rohit, typical South Indian boys, grew up together. They've known each other for a very long time, and as is fairly typical, and ended up becoming engineers, and then went on to do their MBAs as well. Funnily enough, they both went to IIM Lucknow, albeit in different years. I think Jayant is the most senior one. Rohit is a little junior to him. I think just generally, if you watch any of their interviews, you can see their camaraderie come through. I think Jayant had earned Rohit's respect. I think in one of the interviews I watched, Rohit referred to him as a Wikipedia full of ideas and full of information. And I think as a result, those two kept, talking to each other, brainstorming about different ideas, things that they could do with each other. And I think they were both inspired by the idea of building a product in India for the world, right? Funny enough, both of them post their graduation, one went to work so I think Jayant went to work at EY in the investment banking team. Rohit ended up at McKinsey as a consultant. And this is where, and during their professional journey, I think Jayant met Chaitanya, right? Chaitanya was at that time a consultant at EY in their human capital management practice. And Jayant got to know Chaitanya, and I think then the three of them were introduced to each other, and they started talking. And as they were talking, I think they began to share experiences. I think again they were all motivated by wanting to build a global product out of India. And one of the areas that they all seem to agree upon, that where they all seem to spot the opportunity, was human capital management. I think because they were all in client-facing roles, you end up talking about varied topics with your customers, with your clients. Sometimes it ended up around this topic, and I think they all found that was an area that enterprises were not very happy with the solutions that they had, but they also lamented the fact that they did not have too many options, right? And that's when I think the three of them smelled blood and realized that this is something that they could go after, and they decided to do that in August of 2015. They didn't resign, but I think they set the organization up, started building a product out, started thrashing out the problem a little bit more, what would be the right solution. And as I say, the rest is history.
Yeah, and it really is an interesting problem. I mean, you touched on it a bit, but can you tell us what exactly was the problem they're solving?
Yeah, so I think to understand what exactly the problem they were solving was, I think it's important to understand how the industry was set up before them, right? You had a bunch of incumbent players in the market, like the Oracles, the SAPs, the Workdays, right? Now, the challenge with these players was they did not offer a one integrated product. So what happened is very often enterprises, and I'm talking about medium to large scale enterprises who would typically need an HCM solution or want an HCM solution, ended up having to work with 2 or 3 different products, right? And these
So
products,
that they
sorry,
kind of had to stitch different products together to get
yeah,
it to actually function.
exactly. And these products didn't necessarily talk to each other. And as is typical of old world enterprise software, you you know it's not a SaaS product, and so it's not like you install it, you turn it on overnight. You actually
Right.
bring in, so you decide to use a product, and you bring in a whole team of consultant and IT implementation folks who come in and actually set up the product for you. And so it's a little weird, right? Because and I guess this is where SaaS has really worked, because the user or the customer is not who the product is necessarily built for from day zero, right? You have to engineer it to get it to a point where the user or the end customer can actually configure it, customize it to their needs, right? And really, this was the opportunity. The other interesting thing about just HCM as a market, Mazen, is also the fact that in India, budgets. So I don't know. In India, budgets for human capital management were not very high, right? And
Yeah.
all of these are expensive products. And so very often the attitude in India was, and obviously the times were different then when these guys started up. It's not today where people are being offered BMWs and tickets to World Cups to join technology teams. The talent was relatively inexpensive when compared to paying for an annual subscription of any of these softwares, right? So a lot of enterprises actually went down the path of building their own HCM solutions.
Just build it in-house because it's cheaper to just hire a developer and build it out.
Exactly.
So given these challenges, how did Darwinbox go about acquiring their first few customers?
Yeah, I think again, interesting story. So they were clear that they wanted to go after old world, typical medium and large scale enterprises. Because I mean, it made a lot of sense, right? Those people seem to subscribe to that. They seem to accept there was a need. They had a product, and obviously as upstarts, you have to have a little bit of, I guess. A belief that you're going to out to the world and beat the world, and so you go after these guys and say, I'm going to replace Oracle and SAP and work there, and I'm going to get my software in there. Not like, and again, it never works out to plan, and I think they found that. I think they faced a lot of rejection early on, primarily because the enterprise they went to, the often heard feedback was, what if you shut down tomorrow? Right.
Yeah,
I'm not,
they get
I
that.
appreciate your product is great. I understand the challenges, what I have today, but what if you shut down tomorrow? And simply they were not ready to take that risk. Right. And they said, I mean, while we appreciate everything you're doing, we're not going to be the first ones to bite. Right. And there, and again, timing is so important when building, right?
Yeah.
When they were building, it coincided with 2015 was a crazy time. There was startups were getting hyper funded. All of that meant that they were hiring a lot of people, and luckily they were able to then move to still target medium and small large enterprises, but just in a different sector, right? Which were the e-commerce, more technology enabled, technology focused companies, and go after them as customers.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about that, because there was a lot of change in the B2B space. I mean, there were these new companies that were coming up, the likes of Swiggy, Vedantu, Cast24, Big Basket, that were organized very differently from these legacy companies. And perhaps they were willing to take that risk, or what, how were they thinking about differently? Were they not also concerned that this company is going to shut down? And
yeah, so I think a couple of things, right? As an upstart, you're more willing to bet on an upstart, right? And these guys had, as founders, as a founding team, obviously they had credibility, right? Having worked at EY, McKinsey, Google, as individuals, they had McKinsey. They had good, I guess, a good track record. They had a bunch of investors. Again, like an enterprise may not recognize a purchasing manager at a large Tata company is probably not going to recognize some of the early stage investors and things like that. All of which builds credibility, right? When you're a young or a startup. Also, access to higher management is easier in a startup. So your ability to sell through, build a relationship, getting introductions. So all of the sales that they got initially were all through their network, right? So getting connected to the CEO of a delivery is probably easier for them than getting connected to the CEO of Tata Motors, for example, right? And again, so they were able to use those relationships, and delivery, in fact, was one of their first customers or the first customer. And then it starts snowballing, right? Once you get delivery on, which even at that time was fairly large, you use that name and that label to go to the next label and acquire them as customer, right? And because you're like, as an upstart, you see another upstart on as a customer, it becomes easier. And I think the other couple of things they did really interestingly, right? The way the newer age companies, Indian companies were structured was very different from your old world companies, right? In terms of just organizational hierarchy, the needs, and culturally, there was a shift in the kind of employee that these people were hiring, right? So I would assume the average age at a startup is probably much younger than the average age at a typical medium and large enterprise. They are flat. They're flat in terms of their hierarchy. And whereas the structures and the way typical old world HCM solutions were built were more for the old world organizations, right? And so they weren't necessarily the right fit as well for the upstarts. And when I say the right fit, I'm referring to the existing solutions. And this is where, again, I think, and I read an interesting line where they said HCM is a lot about cultural context, right? These guys Darwinbox had the right cultural context. They understood who their customer was, where they understood that their customer needed a lot of customization, needed a lot of configuration, and they built a very modular solution that then enterprises could use as they deemed fit for whatever their organization needed.
Thanks, Varun. Really a fascinating journey and kind of getting to that point. Being in the right place at the right time was a big element of it as well. But Sanya, can you talk us through their product suite and get into a bit more details of what exactly they were offering?
Yeah, sure. I think just before getting into what they were exactly offering, just building on what Varun also said, I think their product suite developed on one of their fundamental thinking, which is of course not explicitly mentioned out there, but think was ingrained in their development from scratch, was they sort of understood this very uh, deep problem in the ecosystem, where in of course like every corporate has to have an HR solution or an HCM solution or solutions, but then every corporate is different. Every corporate has different culture. Every corporate has different processes. Every corporate has sort of like different employee base and kind of requirements, right? And so though they had this mass of corporate, if you will, as a customer segment, each corporate was different. So now to make sure that they cater to this like masses of different ones, essentially they had to make sure that they from the very scratch built that infrastructure out in a way which is super modular. So even if I have to take that solution to different corporates within the same segment or within the same industry, it can quickly be tweaked to suit the needs of the customer. And not a lot of SaaS companies from the very beginning get this. They try to or one and then try to of course standardize or make that templatized and then serve it across a lot of customers, which is of course very different in the HCM kind of world, because as Varun also mentioned, it's also a lot about culture and it's also a lot about people and emotions and sentiments. So it's that's I think one of the key things which was ingrained from the very beginning. And so coming to the product suite, which was of course developed on top of this thinking, they also knew that it cannot be like as we mentioned before, multiple products which a corporate needs to have, and they needed to serve talent acquisition, they needed to serve talent maximization, they needed to serve analytics, like a host bunch of other things for which there are like multiple point solutions. And so now because they had this infrastructure ready where they can just quickly modularize parts of it and create like a complete new customized package for every corporate, they went into the full suite of products, which as I said ranged from talent maximization to hiring to retaining to analytics, and that was possible because of their infrastructure. So I think that's how I would say the product suite evolved and why it evolved more importantly.
It's fascinating. And all of these products are focused mostly on medium and bigger enterprises, right? And it was kind of a conscious decision, I believe, from day one that, okay, we're not going to serve small businesses. Can you tell us a bit more about their business and the unit economics behind it?
Yeah. So Mazen, exactly what you said, right? The unit economics, of course, flow from the fact that they, from the very beginning, focused on mid to large size enterprises. Now, two kind of key levers to it in terms of the business model. One, of course, they focused on mid to large side of enterprises. And the reason was these are the enterprises which will have pocket to fund a solution like Darwinbox, essentially. And to make sure that they are putting all like dollars into innovation where they need to, of course, make money out of it. And that is only possible if you go to bigger enterprises and they value your product and the employees value your product. So I think that's one where the gross margins, of course, are healthy and investors value that. The second reason, which I feel, again, tying to my earlier point, the infrastructure and the modularity, that's very important because, you know, if that were not there, and if you go to mid or large size customers, you go ahead and because you don't want to lose the customers, you go ahead and start building the product from scratch for every single customer, which will quickly like sway your business to a services kind of a business rather than making it a SaaS business. So if they were to do that, they would have probably been like in like lower 20s or lower 30s sort of gross margins, and of course would have been more of a services company. So the I know like it's repeating the point, but the fact that it was from the very scratch modular and they didn't have to redo everything from scratch for every single customer, I think that contributed to their healthy gross margins. And that's how I think the unit economics have stacked up really well.
And how do they stack up against competitors? I mean, they had several, it's quite a competitive space, and there were a lot of, you know, bigger companies, the like of Workday and several other giants in the space. How did they compete and how did they kind of fit in to the landscape?
Yeah. I think like a lot of incumbents. So one, of course, their UI, people like it. And I think the second sort of reason is their philosophy of how they reach out to customers and users. So like you say, in a developer world, like if I come up with something like a Slack, for example, to sell Slack to IT folks of a corporate is very, very tough because they are like, okay, like incumbents like Microsoft, sorry to use that word on the incumbent bucket, but still like they feel that you don't need Slack. Why do you need Slack? It's the employees of that organization who use Slack, who, you know, do like different kinds of add-ons to it, or like developers and like developer companies, which they say, okay, Slack is pretty useful. So the sale is like from inside towards outside. When I say outside, like outside is like majorly like the IT heads of the company who make these decisions on what products to use. So Darwinbox essentially also targeted employees. So employees actually use the product. So it's something which, you know, you measure the stickiness of their product and you see, okay, in my organization, everybody is using this particular product. Everybody is using the features like Pulse to measure their happiness. Everybody is, you know, in like daily, it's very easy. And you feel helped, essentially. An employee feels helped. So that naturally, you know, creates stickiness and creates that flywheel of buying more and more into it. So I think that's one of the key reasons. And second, like from a research and development perspective, they sort of operated in a two-vector kind of philosophy, wherein if I see the one vector is increasing the number of products that they had in the suite, and the second vector is essentially the kind of innovations that they were building in. So they were building in voice technology. They were taking things to WhatsApp. They were doing like a bunch of these innovative things. They're like multilingual in majority of their product suites. And then taking this batch of innovations to every product that they had. So it's sort of, if you think about it, like a 2x2 matrix, and like completely, then there, of course, their objective is to fill this matrix completely in the near term. So I think that's, again, not like a lot of companies think like that. So I think that's again one of the very important differentiation that they had, which is again very, very deep seated. And I think they don't want to talk about it because they don't want other people to copy it. So.
No, and the most recent fundraising round, I believe, took them to a unicorn status. And as you said, you know, frugality is kind of run in their DNA. What do you think the future looks like for Darwinbox?
Yeah. I think it's super exciting, right? Because it's a contrarian view that they have taken for a company in India having enterprise grade ACVs, which is average contract values, because it's very hard for any SaaS company to just be in India, have customers from India, and then scale really, really rapidly with like high ACVs. So I think what Darwinbox currently plans is to expand internationally. And so there is one comfort in the fact that if you have such good ACVs in the Indian market, you can definitely have way bigger ACVs growing internationally. And so I think that itself gives a big comfort to the stakeholders out there. And I think that's one of the key things underpinning their future, like expanding internationally. And also growing like 300-400% year over year if they of course go to international markets. And given their as I said, the developer kind of DNA, I'm pretty sure like they would be able to adapt to international markets and cultures very, very seamlessly. I'm like super excited to see like how they grow and what's the story comes out. So.
Thanks a lot, Sania. Thanks, Varun. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you again next week.